Okay, we're broadcasting now.
Okay.
There we go. Welcome, everyone. We apologize for the technical difficulties. One of our more disruptive ones. I'm sorry you had to be the recipients of that, you all.
I don't think it was your fault.
All right, got people coming in. I'm glad that the memo was received. The link's working. All right, do y'all want to get started?
Sure. That'd be good.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Kat Leach. I'm the social media and promotions coordinator here at Novel in Memphis, Tennessee, independent bookstore. I did want to start by giving a trigger warning to anyone not aware. We will be discussing some sensitive, emotional topics tonight, potentially with a brief reference to method. So we just wanted to be sure that everyone was aware of that before we begin. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Thompson, author of The World Looks Different Now, a memoir of suicide, faith, and family released this year, in conversation with Ann Moss Rogers, whose book, Diary of a Broken Mind, A Mother's Story, A Son's Suicide, and the Haunting Lyrics He Left Behind, also be discussed. Margaret Thompson is a journalist who worked in London for 12 years. During this time, she produced and reported for ABC News and later for other media outlets, covering stories ranging from wars in the Middle East to the British royal family. Upon returning to the United States in the early 90s, she continued working in television as well as writing for print and online publications. Margaret's memoir, The World Looks Different Now, recounts her journey toward healing following the suicide of her son, Kieran, who at the time of his death was a medic in the Army. Ann Moss Rogers is an emotionally naked storyteller, a brain tumor survivor, and author of Diary of a Broken Mind, an International Book Award finalist. She is the owner of the popular Emotionally Naked blog and co-owned and later sold her digital marketing business to pursue suicide prevention after her son Charles died by suicide on June 5th, 2015. He suffered from depression and addiction. She has given a TEDx, Can a Blog Save Lives?, been interviewed by the New York Times, and spoken at the National Institute of Mental Health. A graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, she now lives in Richmond, Virginia with her husband, Randy. Her surviving son, Richard, works in LA as a filmmaker. Welcome, ladies. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you for having us, Kat. We really appreciate it.
We decided this was a good, an opportune time to host this conversation as September is National Suicide Prevention Month. So in that spirit, I will kick it over to Margaret. Let her tell us a little bit about our event tonight.
Thank you so much, Kat. I'm just so honored to be here with Ann Moss. And it's a thrill for me to meet her in this way personally now, finally. After all these years, I felt like I know her and have known her. My son Kieran died before her son Charles did by 5 years. Kieran died in 2010 at the age of 22. But of course, I was searching for many years. And in fact, my book even starts with that. It starts with a scene of I'm up late at night and I'm kind of, well, they call it doom scrolling now with the internet, but I'm kind of scrolling and looking and trying to learn things about the Army because he was in the military and I was trying to learn what he experienced in the Army. So in the course of all this searching and the way you do, I think it's normal now in any situation. You want information, you want research. I came across this blog called Emotionally Naked, and in the title, of course, just really grabbed me. And I thought this is, that Ann Moss was a person I could relate to, that this was a blog that addressed issues of suicide openly. Just the name, Emotionally Naked, told me that there was going to be a frank and sensitive and within guidelines type of discussion about suicide. So I really admired that, and I still do. And I also admire all the things that she does as an advocate for suicide prevention. And I admire the fact that she was able to write a book within 5 years of Charles's death, and get it out and get it published. And it's not a race or anything, but mine took more like 9 years or 10 years from the time of Kieran's death. I started taking some notes, that sort of thing, but I didn't really have a plan to write. And so it's not everybody can move through the writing experience, just like the grief experience. They can move through it at their own pace. So Ann Moss's blog has been there for me. I didn't find it till 5, 6, 7 years after Kieran died, but I've really enjoyed all the things that she's posted because I've learned a lot. And I really just want to turn it back to you, Kat, but I did want to say that in light of the coronavirus, the pandemic, a lot of people have said that my book and Ann Moss's book are very timely, and sometimes they don't really say why. They don't just like go into a lot of detail, but you have to kind of extrapolate from that and think it's because of the virus. There's books about suicide. We need this now, and there are some disturbing statistics from the CDC, according to a survey that they did at the end of June for that 30-day period prior to the end of June. These 18 to 24-year-olds who they surveyed said that they were experiencing suicidal ideation and having a stronger desire to take their lives because of the many stressors having to do with the virus, which we all know about. We could have a whole session just on that. The economic stressors, the social isolation, many of those are factors in suicide. So this is timely and it is important. It's happening during the month of suicide and the week of suicide prevention and suicide awareness is always in September. And then we have the added piece of the virus, which may make us all feel a little more, try to be a little more sensitive to the fact that people might be experiencing greater feelings of wishing to end their lives. So,
well, it's back to school too. And
yes.
any time youth are in a transition, they're at higher risk for suicide. And most youth take their lives, if they are in school, whether it's high school, middle school, or college, during the school year. So this kind of kicks off, and typically November is the high suicide month for students. And then again in April. So, you know, we've got COVID, we have school starting, and transition with COVID is big.
Thank y'all for being willing to talk about and write about this then, because I know that's an important piece of the puzzle, that openness. Well, on that note, I'd love for y'all to tell our audience a little bit about each of your books, you know, the scope, what inspired you to write it, what you cover, kind of what you're hoping that it accomplishes. Would you like to start, Ann Moss?
Yeah, why don't you let Ann Moss start?
Sure. Basically, I started my book because my tribe at Emotionally Naked kept bugging me to do so. And mine started writing itself in my head the day after he died. So once I sat down and did it, it just poured out. And I just sat there for 6 months and I wrote a book and I just did it. That was my first draft. And then of course, there are many months after with editing it. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell a relatable story, and I wanted to tell it in a very different way, from an emotionally naked point of view. So I start with my son's death and how we got the news. And I talk about the things we did right and the things we did wrong, but I also included my son's rap lyrics. He was a creative genius and the funniest, most popular kid in school, so really the least likely to kill himself. And I included those rap lyrics in the book because it tells our family story from 2 points of view. Mine is the parent and his the sufferer. And a lot of people have found that really helpful. So I found a lot of mothers saying to me that, you know, my son has suffered with addiction for many years. And after I read your book, I sat down and talked with him, and I had no idea that he might feel the way Charles did. And when we had that conversation, we talked for 2 hours and we hugged and we cried. So it really opens up a different kind of conversation and allows all people to see it from multiple points of view.
Margaret?
Yes, my story is so interesting to talk about how the books start, how they begin. I think that is one of the most challenging things when you're writing memoir, nonfiction, fiction too, I assume. I don't have the mind for fiction, I don't think, but is how do you begin? What do you do? So I tried some different openings, like Ann Moss said. I tried that getting the news, and I felt I needed to back it up from a structural point of view. I needed kind of a softer introduction to it, and then build more and have that the, whatever you call it, initiating incident or crisis point in the narrative arc. So I started with that scrolling late at night, or that Googling and that searching late at night, and just trying to understand what it was like to go through the induction into the Army. Because my son Kieran decided to go into the Army when he was about 20. And he was in the Army for about 18 months before he took his life. He never deployed. He was scheduled to go to Afghanistan two to 3 months after he died in August of 2010, and they were scheduled to deploy in December of 2010. So I have to kind of unfurl the story kind of gradually and not give too much information too soon. So it starts with the prologue is trying to understand the induction into the Army 3 years after he has died. I'm going through this process and searching for answers. And then it backs up a bit. And the next chapter is him saying that calling to say that he's been accepted into the Army, and very excited about all that. Then about chapter 3 or 4 is that horrible thing about getting the news, which I think is just, you can't really leave that out of a suicide memoir. And then it's sort of, there are kind of so many similarities to Ann Moss's story. I was just so touched. I was moved by Charles's story. They seem so much alike, and they were, Kieran, my son, was not really a soldier. It was being in the Army kind of put a real heavy persona on him. When you put that uniform on, it is defining who you are in such a large way. And that's not really who he was in that sense. He was unsuited because he was much more like Charles. He loved music. He loved to write music. He was that sensitive soul type. So it was a little bit of a different story, but that basically is the kind of synopsis of it, or the narrative arc, is that we receive this terrible news, and then we go through, my husband Tim and I, and our surviving son. We had a younger son. In Charles's case, he had an older son. I mean, an older brother.
Yeah, I had an older brother, Richard.
Older son of the two. And then it's just a matter of how do you cope? How do you move forward? What things happen, and it plays out different scenes like that. And we kind of come to a resolution after about 4 years. And after about 2 years, I do some things with the Army, have some experiences of trying to help others who are training in the Army to become casualty assistance officers. That's all I do. I haven't done all the many things Ann Moss has done as an advocate, but it did give me some sense of purpose and reason to live. And same with the writing. I think that gave some structure, some purpose, and some reason to live. So there's a dramatic event about 2 years after where I kind of have a major shift, and then it kind of winds down to my husband and my younger son and I having a quiet moment on Kieran's birthday, I believe it is, 4 years after. But the implication that it ends after 4 years, or whenever Ann Moss's book stops, say after however many years, of course that's false. It doesn't ever end.
You learn to walk beside grief. At first it's like, I think I thought I would wake up one day and I wouldn't think about him every day. That's ridiculous. I mean, that'll never happen. So it's learning to walk beside grief, and it's learning to incorporate grief in your life. So at first it's this raw, ugly, nasty thing. And then later I want to cuddle with it because it's the only tie that I have to the one I love. And in the book, I actually express that with a letter from grief. So grief writes me a letter. And it starts by saying, it's very painful at first, and everybody tries to push me away thinking I'm the bad guy. But I'm the one that reminded you that he lived. And I put that towards the end because I wanted to build an end with a message of hope. Because I've read books and very well-known books that ended abruptly, and it's such an ugly place that it took me days to get my head out of the dumpster. And I didn't want my readers feeling that way. I wanted them to feel some sense of hope that things would change and that they could do this, that they can survive this loss. It is possible. Other people have done it, and we're not supposed to do it alone.
Thank you. Well, both of your books may help to dispel some of the myths surrounding suicide, some of which are harmful in their own right and might even contribute to the rise in the suicide rate. One of the most frequently heard myths is that talking about suicide can lead the people in your lives to be more likely to take their own lives. Ann Moss, I believe that this is a myth that you are particularly eager to dispel.
That talking about suicide gives people the idea. It is, if I'm speaking to parents about this subject, it is always the first question. So I've learned to put it in my presentations at the beginning. I will still get that question at the end, even though I put it on the very first page. So there've been 6 studies that show that talking about suicide in a sensitive and responsible way actually promotes help-seeking behavior, which means that when people are talking about it, it's like, okay, they're talking about it, they're not afraid of it, therefore I'm going to go talk to that person and tell them that I've been struggling with these thoughts. So it helps people have that conversation, and that's why it's really important to have this conversation not only in September, but every day of the year. Because I missed classic signs of suicide with my son. He wrote on Facebook, if I died, no one would notice for 30 days. That's a bullet point under the phrase, what do people thinking of suicide say? And I didn't recognize it. I felt the despair in the comment. I heard the despair in that last phone call that I included in my book. But I didn't recognize it as suicide because no one had ever taken the time to say, Amos, your child is high risk. They would stop there, and they didn't define what high risk meant. I'm a parent. The first thing I'm not gonna think of, oh, suicide. I'm thinking I'm a parent. I've done a reasonably good job raising my child. He's not hungry. He has clothing. He's got an iPod. We just think of suicide as being something tied to like happiness when it's really tied to trauma and mental illness and also poor problem-solving skills. And it's just so misunderstood. So talking about suicide does not give somebody the idea. But having said that, going into a lot of detail about method or final scenery and what that looked like can be a trigger to vulnerable people, particularly teenagers. So in that conversation, we don't want to talk about method. I mean, I've been asked in a school situation, and I mention it briefly, and then we move on. So I don't give like a lot of details or any graphic descriptions because I know it is a vulnerable population.
Margaret, anything to add?
I just kept thinking about an example of that that's in my book, where my husband and I are kind of hesitant to talk to our sons. The younger one was quite young, but my only first cousin took her life in the early 2000s, and I talk about this or write about this in the book. And certainly with our older son, Kieran, later I wonder, was he influenced by this event? And I say in my writing, I should have talked to him more. I should have said, how do you feel about Mary's death? And just been more open about it. But I think we were those people who are just like so many people who they really feel if they talk about it at all, going back to the same thing, they could possibly provoke someone or cause someone to take their lives because maybe they don't talk about it correctly. Or so that was an example of us just following that routine of stay away from the subject, don't say anything, maybe it's best not to say anything. And later, I don't think that was a good idea.
Well, I'm going to read a few more statements about suicide that you all can help us identify as being a myth or a fact. One is that suicide happens out of the blue with no warning. Is that a fact or a myth?
80% of those who die by suicide, or actually 85%, leave some kind of clue as to their intention. So the trouble is those signs are so subtle, and they say things like, I can't do this anymore. And you don't think, oh, they're going to kill themselves, when they say that. But that's actually one of the most common phrases. Another one is, I'm such a burden, no one would miss me anyway. The word burden coming up a lot. They'll say things like, I can't stand to look at myself in the mirror. So they don't seem like real suicidal phrases, but what I didn't know is people want to be asked. They want to be asked, are you thinking of suicide? And so I've learned to ask that, and it didn't come easy. There is always a sense of uncomfortable nature with that question. And I'm a suicide trainer. It is always uncomfortable, and I've just gotten comfortable with it being uncomfortable.
I think with our son, Kieran, I know he posted a profile picture on Facebook about 6 weeks before he died. I write about that too, but I didn't see that. I was not a friend of his on Facebook. I was not really even active. I was maybe just a little bit on that sort of thing. So I wasn't friends with him. I don't know. I know he defriended certain people about 6 to 8 weeks before he died, and it was, who knows why he defriended certain people and he didn't other people. I think that could have been a sign, but again, we didn't see it. And I'm not making excuses, but if you're apart geographically, we were in Memphis, he was stationed at Fort Bragg. We just didn't know what was going on with him, except very brief phone calls and that sort of thing. And he also kind of went into that mode of not talking, probably because of the military, not sharing any information, any anxieties he was feeling and that sort of thing.
Charles left so many signs. I mean, and he had it written in all of his music. I mean, song after song after song about suicidal thoughts. But he didn't share those with me. He shared them with counselors. He shared them with other teenagers. And I can understand not hearing anything from the teenagers. They're teenagers, right? But I felt like at some of these, you know, we sent him to a therapeutic boarding school. They read his music and they never told me what those lyrics said. And I feel they had a responsibility to put it on my radar and educate me on what the signs of suicide were. So 15 mental health professionals that we saw over the years, and not one of them, you know, mentioned the word suicide. So when I saw posts on social media and I felt the despair in that last phone call, I thought, oh my gosh, he's hit rock bottom, because he was addicted to heroin. He's hit rock bottom. So, you know, he's going to call and ask for help. When in fact, when he called me, he was trying to say in about 100 different ways that he was going to kill himself. And I just didn't recognize it because I didn't have that bucket to put it in. And it has taken me a very long time and a lot of intention to forgive myself and say that I can't look back to those days when I didn't have all the information that I have now. I mean, that's really not fair. And in the emotional state I was in, I wasn't going to figure it out right away. I mean, it took me 2 years to figure all of it out. It wasn't going to happen in a 2-hour conversation.
That's what I identify with so much. As you can see with Ann Moss's story, we experienced some similar things. And I will just say that when Kieran was young, he, as a teenager, he really adored people who had often ended their lives as suicide, like celebrities, people like, I just remember Margaret Thompson in particular. And we didn't take that really that seriously. My husband, Tim, and I, we were just, well, yes, he did take his life, but Margaret Thompson, but we didn't see that he was drawn to several figures like that.
And yeah, they're trying to tell. I remember a conversation in the car with Charles, and he started talking about Michael Jackson dying young, and then Amy Winehouse dying young. And he said, I'm probably going to die young. And I was so dumbstruck by the comment that I didn't ask, why do you think you would die young? And then he was very upset about Robin Williams' death. And I think that Charles put up pictures of his family at every placement and everywhere he ever was, even his bedroom. And I think for a long time, it was pictures of us that kept him from killing himself in his case. You know, everybody has something different, but that was it for him. And I think that when he called me that last time, and I was exhausted, and I couldn't understand him because he was going through withdrawal, I think he thought we'd given up on him. And that did play into his final decision. And that's really hard to know that happened. But I talk about that in the book, and I talk about how when you have a child who's addicted, it's really hard to tell what's the truth and what's fiction, because they're either lying and manipulating, and then they'll throw some truths in there, and it's really almost impossible to sort through it all and figure out what's the right information and what's the wrong information. And you know, I go through his music, and now I know because he wrote certain things, right? And I know his innermost feelings, and I actually know my son better now than I did before he died, because he was so, his lyrics are so emotionally naked, and they're so telling, and kids would steal them. because he expressed so well of how it feels to be addicted or how it feels to feel suicidal. And I think, Margaret, in both of our cases, I think our children started struggling with thoughts of suicide probably as early as elementary school.
Oh, yes, definitely.
And we don't think of young children as people who want to kill themselves. But when they say things like, I'm so ugly, or nobody likes me, that is a time that a parent should intervene and start taking some extra steps. And a friend of mine actually came to me when her son was 8 and told me what he was saying. She said, the pediatrician said he'd grow out of it. And I said, no, you need to do something. And she did, and she's grateful because at each stage she's been able to kind of integrate a new strategy to help him with coping skills. And now she's got him enrolled in a small private school, and that situation has been really good for him. So kids who are sensitive, I mean, your son was very sensitive, so is mine. That's not accepted for young men. I mean, writing rap music was really the only accepted way my son had of expressing how he felt inside. And we don't give our males in our culture a lot of ways to express their sadness. We allow them to be angry, we allow them to be tough, but God forbid they should cry, you know. And when they do, we have a lot of names for that. And crying is a very healthy form of release. And I've seen my husband cry a lot since my son died, and I had not seen him cry a lot before he died. And Australia did a video called Have the Balls to Cry, and it was for men. And I love that ad series. And I wish they'd run that in the United States.
Yeah, I will say, adding quickly to that I did find a poem. Kieran also wrote a lot of poetry. I don't think I saw the poem till after he had died, but he describes in great detail wanting to take his life in 4th grade and
Margaret.
And exactly how he was going to do it. And I took this poem to a therapist, and she did say, this is not normal. But I didn't see it till after he had died. But it was, he said, that long ago at 8 years
Wow.
old. We had, my husband Tim and I had no idea. We had the learning disorder, disability pieces of it, like ADD or ADHD. Yeah. I know that you had maybe some similar diagnoses for Charles, but we did not know anything about that sort of thing at that age.
Oh, I didn't know Charles was struggling with thoughts of suicide until we got the news. And then I read his music because I hadn't seen any of it. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know either. And that's why it was such a shock to us. So it felt like it was out of the blue. We feel like it is because we're not expecting it. But it's typically not really out of the blue. People leave clues. And we need to learn to ask the question, are you thinking of suicide?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tough, it is. And what do most people want to say? They want to say, are you thinking of harming yourself? That's not the same. You have to say, are you thinking of killing yourself?
Right.
I've asked it 100 times now.
Who do cutting or that sort of thing, maybe that's exactly. Not. And in fact, Kieran did have what we thought were attempts, but maybe we were just, again, I'm referencing my husband, maybe we were just so ignorant or so naive. In high school, he had some episodes, but they didn't look totally like attempts. And he didn't say that, like going and getting in a lake at his therapeutic school, going and getting in. he just said, I just kind of like woke up. I was in the water and I didn't know how I ended up there. How did I get there? Which is very, of course, was very alarming, and all of this was extremely alarming, but we didn't know what that was exactly. But I do think that we always had said, and we spent a lot of time with therapists before and after the fact with him, and they said that the number one predictor of suicide is a prior attempt. I think we have that here in our notes. And we were sort of like, well, yeah, we wish somebody had told us this.
Exactly.
Like you're talking about, Ann Moss. Why didn't they just say, hey, if he's getting in the lake at school, that is an attempt, and that is the number one predictor. I think if anyone had ever said that sentence to us, we would have maybe done more. You know, we say, why didn't we do more? But at that time, you're only working with the knowledge you have, and you're doing everything that you have in your capabilities.
I literally asked other therapists, because my son did have an attempt. So my thought was, he's learned his lesson. And, you know, I was empathetic when he told me I did all the right things, but I did say, don't ever do that again. Like I have that power, because people in suicidal thought are in an irrational state of mind. They're like Margaret described, he woke up, he was in a lake. It's like they're in a trance. So when I have spoken to people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, they'll repeat over and over, I'm worthless, there's just no other option. And you think any minute, well, I need to talk them out of it. And really all you need to do is listen and ask questions. But when they come out of it, it's so interesting, because so I was texting back and forth with a young lady on a bridge. And it was once she said, it's really cold outside, that I recognized she was coming out of that trance. And when you said, you know, he woke up and he's in the middle of the lake. And so maybe when he was in the lake, he was thinking, I've got to die, I got to die, I got to die. And then there was enough time between thought and action for the suicidal thoughts to just kind of dissipate, because they have a time limit. Typically it's 20 minutes. And when people come out of it, they're all of a sudden, what was I thinking? Oh my gosh, I almost did what? And that's why you'll see some people with thwarted suicide attempts, like they'll take medication and then they'll go throw up, because they'll kind of come out of it and go, oh my gosh, what have I done? Or they'll go tell a parent if they're young adults. So it is like a trance. And I didn't understand that about it for a very long time.
Yes.
Well, I've got another statement for y'all to tell me if it's a fact or a myth. Suicide is the result of a number of different factors, typically.
And that's true.
Said fact on that. Even though sometimes you'll hear it that it's just one thing. Like I know with, again, going to the coronavirus, there's been a lot written about it's the economic or the economic stressors that could cause an increase. But usually I think, I'm certainly in my son Kieran's case, that he was dealing with multiple factors or multiple stressors. But a lot of times the military will say, oh, it's relationship problems, or that's the number one thing. But there are also other stressors. But I think the AFSP, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, they talk about it being more a synergistic thing of stressors and health concerns, which could be physical health concerns or mental, or both.
They have to be vulnerable to suicide. I mean, in the case of, all right, people who are addicted and suffer from depression are 5 times more likely to die by suicide. So they have to be vulnerable in some way. And a lot of people thought it was just the drug addiction. And that is a big driver in his case. But it's not the only reason. He suffered from depression. He had substance use disorder. He was going through withdrawal. He'd just broken up with a girlfriend. He thought we had given up on him. And those are just 5, and I think I had listed maybe 10 reasons that he died by suicide. And those are just the ones that I know about. Oh, he had an upcoming court case, and he was concerned about that. He thought he was going to go to jail, and they didn't have any evidence, so there wouldn't have been anything for him to send to jail for. But it's always kind of this perfect storm of events. And then you'll see at schools where they say bullying, you know, this child killed herself because of bullying. That's just one reason. Millions of children every year are bullied, and most of them don't kill themselves. So the person has to be vulnerable, and it could be vulnerable from trauma. It could be vulnerable from mental illness. And I think, Margaret, you and I have this in common too. Charles, what was trauma to Charles was not trauma to my older child, Richard, or I wouldn't have seen it as trauma. Like my whole brain tumor fiasco, when I got a brain tumor, I had to go have brain surgery, and then I had to go back and have another brain surgery, and I had to go out of town, and the MRI said it came back. My older son was able to manage those thoughts and that worry, and Charles was not. And I thought he was like Richard in that regard. And after he died, I found so many lyrics about referencing that brain tumor and how worried he was about it. So it was very, very traumatic to him. And it was less traumatic to my older child, Richard. So your more sensitive children are going to be traumatized by things that you wouldn't normally consider a trauma. Now, of course, that's a trauma that no one can avoid. I mean, it happened to me. It wasn't like I could do anything else about it. But I do wish I had recognized that earlier, but I'm not real sure what I could have done about it, because, you know, we were very open with conversation with that. I just didn't recognize the difference in my children at that point.
Yes, mine were very different too. Our younger son, Matt, was like your older son, very resilient, and he also had to go through all of this experience. And my younger son, Matt, was 15 when Kieran took his life, and I became instantly very, very protective. Just partly something could happen to him, but also protective of him. My husband, Tim, and I were both protective of him, so it wouldn't just ruin his life. You know, I said my life's ruined, but he still had 3 more years of high school, and we tried to make that kind of like as, quote, normal as possible, but it was extremely difficult to try to keep things, quote, normal. And I just wanted to add too that I think a perfect storm is the absolute descriptor. That is the perfect description of all of the pieces that have to come together, or that in Kieran's case had to converge at a particular time on a particular day for this to happen. It was a lot of different pieces. And one of those, I think, is feeling trapped. That same therapist who said an 8-year-old who wants to take his life and describes it in great detail, this is not normal. I'm going, yes, I know this is not normal. But that same therapist said feeling trapped, in her opinion, was the #1 predictor of someone who might take their life. But that's just, again, one of those pieces. But it can be a very large piece, I think, again, if you're in the Army and you think you're going to be court-martialed and you think there is no way out of going to Afghanistan, you feel those walls closing in. And impulsivity, I don't know if we've talked about that already, but that's also a big piece of it. I've seen depression plus substance abuse plus impulsivity equals a very imminent risk of suicide if you take those ingredients and combine them together in one way or another. But I do feel for Kieran that definitely that piece of, I've got to go to Afghanistan. I can't get out of it. Mom has told me that I'm going to have to go, but I was in, you know, he was in denial, and it was just closing in, closing in, closing in. And it, at least half on the military piece of things, half of military suicides are soldiers or service members who never deployed. So
interesting. I didn't know that.
And right now, because we're not actively involved in a big a war, that's nothing like that about our soldiers overseas. It's not getting a lot of attention. I think the problem of suicide in the military is not getting the attention that it deserves, and in our society in general, partly because it's obscured by news about the virus right now.
Yeah.
Well, I would like us to do one more fact or myth briefly before we can do any audience questions we might have. This one I feel is important because whether or not we have experienced suicidal thoughts or have had a close family member suffer from them, this is something that I think all of us in our everyday conversation have heard someone say, and is that suicide is a selfish act. Can you address that, whether you believe that is a myth or a fact?
I definitely feel it's a myth. I mean, I know it's a myth because it's an act of desperation. So picture that you are in a house that's on fire, and you're on fire, and there's a bucket next to you of water. You're going to grab that bucket of water and pour it on yourself to stop that fire. And that's kind of how it is with suicide. People are in that moment of intense emotional pain, and it won't stop, and their brains are telling them you got to die, and they grab for something to end their life. And that's why they're putting time between thought and action is important. But it's an act of desperation and not of selfishness. You know, it's not because they're not thinking of anyone else. They're thinking, I'm a burden and everybody would be better off without me. Margaret, what about you?
I think it's similar. I agree with Ann Moss, but I did keep struggling with that. I still saw it. Sometimes that anger would come out, and anger is a big component, I think, for suicide loss survivors. Just the anger that they feel is just difficult to control, difficult to manage. And in those moments of anger, I would say to myself, that was so selfish of him. How could he do that? I too have health issues, and it was sort of like, how could you do that to me? And it takes so much compassion, I think, even though, of course, you feel a lot of compassion for your own child anyway, but compassion to remember how much they were struggling. And I do really like that analogy of just, they had something there, and it was a bucket of water, and they could extinguish that pain. And it was, again, I know with Kieran, very impulsive. And if the means hadn't been there, just instantly, like you said, the great tragedy is in 20 minutes, that feeling could have changed. But I do struggle that with the feelings occasionally that it just can seem so selfish.
Well, thank you.
And I'm just going to say this briefly, but that over 55% of the deaths by firearm in this country are not homicides, they're suicides. And a lot of people don't know that.
And we have double the number of suicides that we do homicides.
Mm-hmm.
Nearly 50,000 last year. So it's a very sobering problem. I mean, I run into people all the time, and they've said, it's in my family, my brother, my father, my sister-in-law, you just have a few conversations with people, or you just get in conversation with people. And if they know you're a suicide loss survivor, they start telling their family story.
And that's why I'm glad there are other people other than myself, like Margaret, who've written a book and told their story, because it's not one story that's going to get people's attention. It's multiple stories. We need stories from the military, from LGBTQ, from people who've lost teens or young adults or seniors or, Alaskan natives or any of the high-risk groups, or even if they're not in the high-risk group. The more we tell our stories, the more people will engage in the topic.
I agree. I agree with that. It's a very difficult subject. It's difficult to get published in when people know what your subject matter is. You've got that going on. And like, for example, mine is the only book, and I wouldn't say this really totally publicly, but I had my researcher do research, and I researched, and we could not find any other book by the mother of an active duty service member who took his or her life. Could not find one.
Wow.
And there is a place for every one of those stories. Like Ann Moss says, whatever the particular circumstances. I know I didn't want my book just labeled, well, this is only for people who've lost a soldier or service member. I wanted it to be larger than that, and to be a message for anyone who suffered really any kind of loss, even trying to elevate it beyond just being about suicide, just being about loss. But I do feel that there should be more. And as someone who's been in the media for a long time, and Moss, I know you have too, that there's the only time this story, the suicide stories in the media, is when it's a celebrity. And I understand why that attracts a certain amount of attention, but I don't know what people's fascination with it is. I think they say that it's oh, well, hey, they had problems. And there's a contagion factor too. I think Ann Moss, you and I were talking about that if it is mentioned in the news, there are copycat or contagion related incidents that occur. I mean, I'm glad that I'm sorry for the incidents, of course, but I'm glad that it brings attention to the issue of suicide, but I would like for there to be other ways for attention to be brought to suicide rather than just through celebrity deaths.
Thank you so much. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left overall. Edwin has a question. He wanted to know, Margaret, what made your son want to serve in the military?
I think he wanted a secure job, a secure career. He had not done well because he had ADHD, and he had not done well in school. It was a way of doing sort of more of a hands-on type of profession, and have really security, because he had a wife and a 2-year-old child at the age of 22. So he had a lot on his plate, and it's easy as a mom to say he was not ready for that, and he was too young for all of that responsibility. And I think that did play a role. But the Army, he succeeded in the Army in many ways, and he was a medic. I come from a medical family, so I used to tease him all the time. Oh, wow, you're taking after my mom and dad, because you know how to do these tourniquets, and you know how to do these IVs, and you just could snap those things in and help all the other medics when they were struggling and they were trying to learn. So I think what scared him more than anything else was success, the fact that he was succeeding. And many people in the military, I was even talking to someone the other day about this, said if you succeed in the military, they're going to heap more responsibility on you, which was what happened. So they said, you're one of 5 medics going to Helmand Province to support the Marines, and you're in charge of the health and well-being of 60 guys and gals. And so you can get in too deep. There was too much responsibility and too many things going on that were beyond his skill set and his learning disability issues.
Well, Pam Dixon lost her son, and she wanted to ask, Do you ladies feel that depression and suicidal ideation is still one of the hardest issues for medical professionals to know how to deal with?
I do. I think where we've made some progress there, I get invited to a few medical conferences, and I will say that doctors are now starved for the information. And there are more pediatricians doing the Ask Suicide Screening Tool, which is 4 questions. But where we struggle the most is doctors want to fix something. And there are not very many mental health professionals, depending on the age. So sometimes they won't start the process of doing any screening because they're like, I've got nowhere to refer this child. But we do have telemedicine. And if you're in a rural area, there are some options. And I always encourage primary care providers and pediatricians to please connect with at least one referral resource that can at least do an assessment. So what I would like to see the medical profession do is not call it a referral, but say, we're gonna send you out for a psychological evaluation, have that person or that child come back, and from there, you can choose or find a mental health professional that best suits that child. Because what happens is when they refer, the mental health professional says, I can't take care of that. So they're looking long-term, which is good, but we want to get that assessment and those answers quickly. And then we can refer out and figure out where they should go from there. Does that make any sense?
Pam commented her question, she cut her own question off too soon. She meant to fill in the detail that she lost her son 17 years ago, her son Tyler, and that it seems to her that it's more prevalent today than ever. And so I think that was informing her question.
It's the number two cause of death for 10 to 34-year-olds. And in Colorado, it's number 1. And then there's some other states where it's number 1.
Well, we have a comment and then we'll wrap up the Q&A. Margaret's insight, this is from Diane Callahan Edens. Margaret's insight to loss made me much more open to compassion and taking action for survivors. So thank you all. Well, we're about out of time. Would y'all like to tell our audience how they can learn more about your story and about your work? How to find you?
Well, I'm at Margaret Riley Thompson, and that's Thompson without a P. I know that's long. Riley is my maiden name, R-I-L-E-Y, so it's Margaret Riley Thompson. I used to write under that name, so I kind of include that because I have a lot of work published under that name. So that's my handle for everything: website, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. My Twitter is just M Riley Thompson, R-I-L-E-Y Thompson, and I'd love to hear from anybody.
And is Riley R-I-L-E-Y?
Yes.
All right, I'm typing this into the chat, y'all, just so you can see it and maybe screen cap it for our audience members. All right, Ann Moss?
If you look up the name Ann Moss Rogers or Emotionally Naked, you'll find I have a professional speaking site at annmossrogers.com, and emotionallynaked.com is my blog. And I'm at Ann Moss Rogers on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and then I got a lot of social media.
Don't we all?
I know, probably too much.
Well, y'all, I just want to thank you both for being with us this evening and for sharing and being so vulnerable and open. In my personal opinion, the world would be a better place if we all made space and time for that more often. So I appreciate your participating in this conversation this evening. And it was a great conversation, really was.
Thank you to Novel for having the guts to take it on and present an event. So Margaret and I are really grateful for that.
Yes, thank you so much, Kat. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. And for attendees who would like to review it or share it with friends, it will be posted to Novel's YouTube channel, which if you search Novel events, that'll pop up, and we'll have it added probably as soon as tomorrow. Ladies, want to show us your books one more time?
I was going to say, Margaret, show your book.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, even if it's backwards.
Mine has a reflection.
Looks
Yours
perfect
doesn't.
for the viewer. It looks perfect.
Okay.
Thank y'all again. Have such a wonderful evening.
You
Thank
too.
Thanks to everyone who attended.
Bye, Kat.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks.